After ruining me for a lie, my parents are now begging me to save them. It's funny how a single sound can define your entire life. For me, that sound was the rich, resonant tone of a grand piano. Not the tinny, out-of-tune upright in the school auditorium, but the deep, full-bodied voice of an instrument that felt like an extension of my own soul. From the moment my small hands first touched the keys, I knew that music wasn't just a hobby. It was the language I spoke, the air I breathed. My parents, however, didn't quite see it that way. In our family, success was measured in stock portfolios, quarterly reports, and corner offices. It was a world of spreadsheets and cold, hard numbers, and I was the dissonant note in their carefully orchestrated symphony. My older brother, Julian, was the star of their show. He was everything they wanted, a perfect blend of charisma and sharp intelligence. He breezed through business school, landing a high-paying job right out of college, and was on the fast track to becoming a partner at his firm. His life was a straight line, a perfectly calculated trajectory to the top. My life, by contrast, was a series of unpredictable melodies, full of passion and creative chaos. While Julian was mastering corporate strategy, I was losing myself for hours in Chopin and Rachmaninoff. They praised Julian's ambition and drive, but my own ambition, to be a concert pianist, was treated as a charming but ultimately frivolous pursuit. They would often say things like, "That's lovely, Leo, but what are you going to do for a real career?" It was a question that felt less like a genuine inquiry and more like a gentle dismissal of my existence. This constant, subtle belittlement eroded my self-esteem over time. I felt like a disappointment, a constant source of quiet worry for my parents. The only person who seemed to truly understand me was my grandfather, a retired music teacher. He saw my passion not as a flaw, but as a gift. He was the one who bought me my first real piano, a used but well-cared-for upright, and he was the one who sat with me for hours, patiently guiding my fingers and my heart. He would always tell me, "Don't let them make you small, Leo. Your music is bigger than their numbers." His words were my anchor in a sea of corporate expectations. The dynamic between Julian and me was even more complicated. He wasn't cruel, not in the way my parents were emotionally distant. He was just oblivious. He lived in a world where his success was the only logical outcome, and he couldn't fathom a different path. He'd occasionally pat me on the back and say, "Don't worry, little brother, you'll find a nice girl and a stable job someday." It was condescending, but I knew he didn't mean it maliciously. To him, my struggles were just part of a phase, a cute quirk that would eventually fade away. Everything changed the year I turned 18. I had auditioned for the prestigious Juilliard School of Music. It was my dream, the only future I had ever truly wanted. The day the acceptance letter arrived, my parents were surprisingly ecstatic. It was a rare moment of genuine pride. They promised to pay for my tuition, saying it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and that they would do whatever it takes to help me succeed. It felt like a miracle. For the first time, I felt seen, validated. I called my grandfather, and he just laughed with pure joy. "I told you they couldn't ignore your music forever," he said. But their newfound enthusiasm was short-lived. A few weeks later, their mood shifted. The subtle tension in the house returned, heavier and more suffocating than ever before. My parents started having hushed conversations, their voices low and strained. When I asked them what was wrong, they would just say it was a financial issue and that I shouldn't worry about it. I was so caught up in my excitement for Juilliard that I didn't question it. I trusted them. I believed that their promise was real. That was my fatal mistake. I should have known that in their world, promises were just another form of negotiation, and I was just another asset, easily liquidated. The final blow came in the living room, a few days before I was supposed to send in my first tuition deposit. My parents sat me down, their faces grim. My mother spoke first, her voice cold and hollow. "Leo," she said, "we have some bad news. We can't pay for your tuition to Juilliard." My heart dropped to my stomach, a cold, sickening lurch. I couldn't speak. My father took over, his words like a brutal, clinical diagnosis. Julian's business venture ran into some legal trouble. He owes a significant amount of money to his partners, and the only way to keep him out of bankruptcy is to pay off his debts. Your tuition money, it's gone. We had to use it to save him. The lie, the terrible, unforgivable truth, hit me like a physical blow. The money they had promised me, the key to my entire future, had been sacrificed to save the one who had everything. In their eyes, my future was worth less than his past. The silence that followed my father's words was more deafening than any sound could have been. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, as if a physical weight had settled on my chest. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. My mind was a whirlwind of disjointed images: the Juilliard acceptance letter, the hours I'd spent practicing, my parents' false promises, and Julian, always Julian, the golden son whose flaws were just another excuse for them to fail me. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years finally erupted, not in a loud, dramatic shout, but in a cold, controlled fury that felt far more dangerous. "You lied to me," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "You told me it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You promised." My mother tried to reach for my hand, her eyes glistening with what I now knew was just a desperate attempt at sympathy. "It was a risk, Leo," she said, her voice shaking. "You have to understand. Julian is our son. His future is a certainty. Your music, it's a beautiful talent, but it's not a sure thing." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. They weren't just taking my money. They were invalidating my passion, my dreams, my very identity. My father, in his typical stoic manner, just looked at me with a weary resignation, as if I were the one causing a scene, as if my heartbreak was an inconvenience to their family's perfect narrative. I stormed out of the house, not even bothering to pack a bag. The suffocating air of their judgment was too much to bear. I walked for hours until my legs ached and my anger had turned into a dull, hollow ache of betrayal. I knew I couldn't go back. That house wasn't a home. It was a prison built from conditional love and impossible expectations. The only person I could turn to was my grandfather. He wasn't surprised when I showed up at his small apartment looking like a ghost. He just let me in, made me a cup of tea, and listened without judgment as I recounted the whole story, the tears finally coming, hot and bitter. He didn't offer to solve my problems or to give me money he didn't have. He just gave me his presence, his quiet strength, and his unwavering belief in me. "Their choice says nothing about your worth, Leo," he said. "It says everything about theirs." The next few months were a brutal education in survival. I took a job as a dishwasher at a local diner, the grease and grime a stark contrast to the polished keys of a piano. The work was exhausting, the pay was abysmal, but it was mine. I didn't ask my parents for a single dime. Every day, I called my grandfather. He would give me lessons over the phone, humming melodies to me, pushing me to keep my fingers moving, even if all I had was a quiet tabletop to practice on. My new life was hard, filled with loneliness and the persistent anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, but there was a strange sort of freedom in it. I was no longer trying to prove my worth to anyone. I was just trying to survive. One evening, after my shift, I found an old, worn-out piano in the corner of a small park downtown. The keys were yellowed, some notes were out of tune, but it was a piano. I sat down and started to play. It was as if all the anger, the frustration, and the grief I had bottled up poured out through my fingertips. I wasn't playing for an audience or a grade. I was playing for myself. A small crowd started to gather, their faces a mix of curiosity and quiet appreciation. One of them, a man with a kind, weathered face, stood there for a long time, listening intently. After I finished, he approached me. He introduced himself as Marcus, a sound engineer at a small independent recording studio. He told me he hadn't heard playing with that much soul in years. "You've got a story to tell, kid," he said, gesturing at the dilapidated piano. "I can hear it in every note. You sound like you've been through a war." He handed me a business card. "Come by the studio tomorrow. We're working on a project for a local indie film, and the director is looking for a composer who can deliver something raw and real. No pay, just a chance to get your name out there." It was a small offer, but it felt like a lifeline. It was a chance to prove my grandfather right, that my music was indeed bigger than their numbers. Marcus's offer felt like the first breath of clean air after suffocating for months. It was a chance, a tiny crack in the wall of my despair. The next day, I went to his studio, a cramped, cluttered space filled with old equipment and the dusty smell of creation. The director, a young woman named Chloe, was blunt but kind. "Marcus told me you've got a story to tell. I need music that feels like a life unraveling, then slowly stitching itself back together." Her words resonated deeply. It was the perfect description of my own journey. I wasn't just a pianist playing classical pieces anymore. I was a storyteller, using my music to process my pain. Working with Marcus and Chloe was a humbling, exhilarating experience. For the first time, I was using my musical knowledge in a professional setting, but not in the way Juilliard had taught. It was about feeling and intuition, not just technical perfection. The hours were long, the pay non-existent, but I had a purpose again. I worked the diner job during the day and spent my nights hunched over a synth and a MIDI keyboard, translating the turmoil in my heart into a score. The music came pouring out, a raw and honest reflection of my anger, my grief, and the fierce hope that had kept me going. I wrote with a kind of desperate energy, as if the notes themselves were a testament to my survival. The film, a gritty, powerful drama about a family's secrets, was my canvas. The film made the rounds at a few indie festivals, and, much to everyone's surprise, it was a hit. My name was right there in the credits. Music by Leo. The reviews praised the film's powerful score, calling it hauntingly beautiful and the emotional heart of the story. The recognition felt surreal. A few small gigs followed, scoring for local commercials, a short film, a theater production. I wasn't getting rich, but for the first time in my life, I was making a living doing what I loved. I was a professional artist, not a hobbyist. My grandfather, my biggest supporter, was beaming with pride. "See, Leo," he said over the phone one day, "you didn't need their path. You built your own." His words meant more to me than any paycheck. My growing success gave me the courage and the means to move into a place of my own, a small, brightly lit studio apartment above a quiet bookshop. It felt like my first real home. The walls were empty, the space was small, but it was all mine. I got a second-hand baby grand piano, a beautiful instrument with a warm, mellow tone, and it was the centerpiece of my life. I had no contact with my family. I had changed my number, my email, and my life was a world away from theirs. The silence was a quiet balm, a constant reminder of my freedom. I never thought about them, not really. They were a part of a story that I had finally fully moved past. Then the messages started. First, a series of texts to an old, rarely used email. They were from my mother. Her messages were a mix of fawning praise and thinly veiled attempts at reconciliation. "Leo, we just saw the article about you. We knew you had it in you. We are so incredibly proud." Proud? The word was a poison. It was the same word they had used before they took my future from me. I deleted the emails without a reply. I knew their pride wasn't about me. It was about themselves, about the fact that their black sheep was now a success they could claim as their own. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at my old apartment, forwarded to my new address. It was from Julian. The handwriting was neat and precise, just like him. He started with an apology that felt more like an excuse. He explained that his business had a temporary setback and that they had to make a difficult decision. He congratulated me on his success, and then the real reason for the letter came into view. "We're facing some new legal challenges now," he wrote. "The first payment was just the start. It's getting serious. Dad had to take out a second mortgage on the house. We're in a tough spot." The final line was a gut punch. "You've done so well for yourself, Leo. You're our only hope. Can we talk?" My hands were shaking as I read his words. It wasn't just a request, it was an expectation. They saw me not as a person, but as a solution to their problems. The same people who had dismissed my life's work as a frivolous pursuit were now asking me to be their savior. The bitterness was a physical thing in my mouth. They were coming back for more. I didn't reply to Julian's letter. I simply let it sit on my counter for days, a physical reminder of the poison I had worked so hard to flush from my system. The rage, the bitterness, the pain, it all came rushing back. But this time it was different. It wasn't a wild, uncontrolled fire. It was a cold, calculating resolve. They wanted to talk? Fine. I would give them their conversation, but it would be on my terms, in a public place, and with no illusions about what was happening. It was my final performance for an audience of 3. I chose a quiet, upscale coffee shop downtown, miles away from their suburban life. When I walked in, they were all there, a perfect tableau of my past. My father, with a grim, set jaw, my mother, her face arranged in a mask of worried concern, and Julian, wearing a crisp suit that belied the debt he was drowning in. He offered me a weak, forced smile. "Hey, Leo," he said, like we were just old friends catching up. I didn't return the smile. I simply sat down. My mother, true to form, started with the soft approach. "Leo, we just want to say how incredibly sorry we are. We never should have lied to you." My father nodded along, looking at the table. We made a mistake. Their apologies felt hollow, a performance they had rehearsed 100 times. I let them get it all out, the hollow regrets, the feigned pride, the desperate pleas for a clean slate. Then I cut through it all. "Let's be clear," I said, my voice steady and low. "The problem wasn't the money. The money was a symbol. The problem was that you never saw me. You saw Julian's problems as real and mine as a fantasy. You didn't lie because you had to. You lied because in your minds, my future was worth less than his past. And Julian, you didn't just make a mistake. You used me. You let me believe I was going to Juilliard, all the while knowing the money was gone. You stood there and watched me suffer for your greed and your failure." Julian flinched, but quickly put on a show of indignation. "That's not fair, Leo. I was in trouble. I was desperate." My father finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary resignation. "We did what we had to do to protect him. He's your brother." The familiar words were a gut punch. I shook my head slowly, feeling all the years of pain crystallize into a single moment of clarity. "No," I said, "he's the son you always wanted, and I am the son you never deserved." The air crackled with a cold, shocking silence. My mother began to cry, but I felt nothing. Their tears no longer had power over me. They were a tool, not an emotion. Then the real reason for the meeting finally emerged. My father pushed a folder across the table. It was filled with legal documents and financial statements. "We need a significant amount of money to settle this suit," he said, his voice flat. "We've used everything we have. Julian is going to lose everything. Your grandfather is getting older, and his apartment, well, we don't know what's going to happen to it if we don't find a solution." My heart felt a sharp, cold pang. They were trying to use my grandfather against me, the one person who had been a constant source of support. "Your grandfather taught me more than you ever did," I said, my voice now loud enough to turn a few heads. "He taught me that my worth isn't based on my bank account and that my music is bigger than your numbers. He taught me to stand on my own 2 feet, and that's exactly what I did." I looked each of them in the eye, one by one. "You wanted to talk? This is me talking. My success is mine. It's the direct result of you abandoning me. You don't get a share of it. You forfeited that right the day you took my money and told me my dream was worthless." I pushed the folder back across the table. "I will not give you a single penny." I stood up, pushing my chair back with a loud scrape. They stared at me in disbelief. They were so used to my compliance, my quiet disappointment, my efforts to please them. My refusal was a foreign language they couldn't understand. I looked at Julian, seeing not the golden boy, but a broken man who had lived his whole life as a performance. "Julian," I said, "I forgive you for what you did, but I will never forget it." I then looked at my parents, not with hatred, but with a profound, final sadness. You told me I was nothing without you. You were wrong. I was everything without you. I turned and walked out, leaving the weight of my past behind me. The world outside the coffee shop felt vibrant and alive. The sound of a street musician playing a saxophone filled the air. For the first time, I felt truly free. It wasn't a happy ending in the way a family would reconcile. It was a happy ending because I had finally reconciled with myself. I was a musician, a survivor, and I was finally home.